The sound was small, a wet, sickening pop, like a rubber band giving up the ghost. But in the cavernous silence of the empty gym, it sounded like a gunshot. I didn't scream. You don't scream in this building. You endure. But the air left my lungs in a sharp, ragged hiss as I crumbled to the hardwood. The pain wasn't a dull ache. It was a scream trapped under my skin, radiating hot and electric up the back of my thigh. The gym lights hummed overhead, indifferent and blindingly bright, casting long, severe shadows across the court. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to breathe through the shock, trying to force the world to stop spinning. When I opened them, he was there, Coach Brady. He hadn't left. He was standing by the double doors, a dark, motionless silhouette against the hallway light. He wasn't moving to help. He was just watching. And in that moment, I realized the usual professional distance between us had just snapped along with my hamstring. To understand why I was on the floor at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, you have to understand the ecosystem we live in. Division I athletics isn't a hobby. It's a meat grinder disguised as an education. You are an asset first, and the human being a distant second. The university owns your schedule, your diet, your sleep, and your body. Perfection isn't the goal here, it's the baseline. If you aren't perfect, you are replaced. The air in the facility is always thick with the specific kind of pressure. A heavy, invisible weight that settles in your chest the moment you walk through the glass doors. It smells of stale sweat, floor wax, and the sharp chemical tang of anxiety. And at the center of this high-pressure system was Coach Brady. He wasn't the kind of coach who threw chairs or screamed until his veins popped. Those men are easy to tune out. Their anger is just noise. Brady was different. He was severe, observant, a man who spoke in corrections rather than compliments. He was an architect of silence. When he walked into a room, the chatter died, not out of fear, but out of a desperate need to be noticed by him. He had a way of looking at you that made you feel like he was taking you apart, examining every flaw in your mechanics, every hesitation in your mind. He didn't offer praise. If you did well, he simply didn't correct you. That silence was the highest honor you could get. The practice earlier that day had been a chaotic storm of squeaking sneakers, shouting, and the relentless thud of balls against the backboard. But now, hours later, the gym was a different creature entirely. The silence after hours is heavy. It has a texture. It presses against your eardrums. I stayed late because I was addicted to that silence, and because I was terrified of being average. I was the guy who stayed to shoot 500 extra free throws, the guy who ran lines until his lungs burned, all driven by a compulsion to fix flaws that only I, and Brady, could see. I told myself it was about the scholarship. I told myself it was about the team. But deep down, in the places we don't talk about, I knew it was about him. I wanted to be the one thing he couldn't find a flaw in. I wanted to be the exception to his rule. I thought I was alone. I had seen the rest of the staff leave. I had heard the heavy clank of the locker room doors sealing shut. So I pushed harder. I set up the cones for the suicide drills, the most brutal conditioning we had, and I ran them with a frantic, desperate intensity. I was trying to outrun the exhaustion, trying to prove something to the empty bleachers. My legs were heavy, filled with lead, but I ignored the warning signs. I ignored the tightness in my lower back and the tremor in my quads. I was on the final turn, the pivot that sends you sprinting back to the baseline. I planted my left foot, intending to explode off the line, to finish strong in case the ghosts were watching. But the body has a way of vetoing the mind. The fatigue I had been suppressing all season finally collected its debt. My form broke, just for a fraction of a second. My weight shifted wrong. The angle was too steep, and the muscle couldn't hold the tension. That was the moment the drill went wrong. It wasn't a heroic failure. It was a clumsy, mechanical breakdown. The snap was immediate. A sudden, sharp betrayal that sent me crashing down to the polished wood, stripping away the facade of the invincible athlete and leaving me there, gasping for air, waiting for a judgment that was already standing in the doorway. My first instinct was a lie. It was a reflexive, conditioned response, drilled into me since freshman year. Never stay down. I scrambled to get my feet under me, my hands slipping on the sweat-slicked floor, desperate to reassemble the facade of the invincible athlete before the dust even settled. I tried to stand, to force the leg to bear weight, to pretend that the sickening pop was just a joint cracking, just a noise and not a catastrophe. But the body doesn't lie, even if the mind wants to. As soon as I straightened my knee, a white-hot bolt of agony shot up the back of my thigh, seizing the muscle in a violent, cramping knot. It felt like the fibers were being torn apart by dull hooks. I gasped, the sound wet and humiliating in the quiet gym, and grabbed the edge of the bleachers to keep from collapsing again. I stood there, trembling, sweat stinging my eyes, refusing to look at the door. If he had run over, if he had shouted, if he had shown even a flicker of panic, I think I could have handled it. Panic is messy. Panic is human. But Coach Brady didn't panic. He didn't even move. When I finally dragged my gaze up to meet his, he was still leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, a dark, immovable shape cut out against the harsh, fluorescent light of the hallway behind him. He was watching me with that terrible, clinical detachment, like a scientist observing a specimen that had just failed a stress test. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at the leg. He was analyzing the angle of my hips, the way my knuckles were white-knuckling the plastic seat of the bleacher, the tremor running through my frame. The silence that stretched between us was louder than the shout of the injury. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. I wanted him to leave. I wanted him to turn off the lights and lock the door so I could drag myself to the locker room in the dark and scream into a towel. But he pushed off the doorframe. He stepped into the gym. The sound of his dress shoes on the hardwood was distinct. Click, click, click. A rhythmic, approaching judgment. He didn't rush. He walked with a terrifying, measured calm, closing the distance between us without ever breaking eye contact. The air in the gym seemed to shift as he got closer, the vast, empty space suddenly feeling crowded. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that I could smell the faint, sharp scent of his cologne, mixed with the starch of his shirt and the underlying aroma of black coffee. He didn't ask if it hurt. He didn't ask what happened. He simply looked down at my leg, then back up to my eyes. His gaze was heavy, physical. "You're favoring the left," he said. His voice was low, devoid of sympathy, stating a fact as if reading a weather report. "I'm fine," I lied. The words tasted like ash. "Just a cramp. I didn't drink enough water." Brady didn't blink. He didn't even dignify the lie with a response. He just waited, letting my words hang there in the stale air until they withered and died. He knew. He had probably heard the snap from the hallway. He stepped closer, invading the personal space I had been trying to maintain all season. The heat radiating from him was palpable, a sudden contrast to the air-conditioned chill of the room. He wasn't just a coach in that moment. He was a wall I was about to crash into. "Walk," he said. It was a challenge. I let go of the bleacher. I took one step, gritting my teeth so hard I thought they might crack. The second step was a disaster. The leg gave way, the muscle refusing to fire, and I stumbled. I would have hit the floor again if he hadn't moved. His hand shot out, gripping my upper arm to steady me. The contact was electric, firm, grounding, and terrifyingly strong. His fingers dug into my bicep, holding me up, and for a second, the pain in my leg was eclipsed by the shock of his touch. "That's what I thought," he murmured, his voice right by my ear now. He didn't let go immediately. He held me there, balanced between falling and standing, forcing me to acknowledge the failure. Then he released me, stepping back to restore the void between us. He pointed toward the double doors, his expression unreadable, but his eyes dark with something that looked dangerously like focus. "Training room," he commanded. "Now." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order that carried an undertone of care, buried deep under layers of authority. He turned and walked away, not waiting to see if I followed. He knew I would. I limped after him, the journey down the long, echoing hallway feeling like a march toward an execution. Or perhaps something far more dangerous. The panic began to rise in my throat, not because of the injury, but because I was following him into the one room in the building where there were no bleachers, no cameras, and nowhere to hide. The training room was a different universe entirely. If the gym was a cathedral of noise and sweat, this place was a laboratory, a sterile, hermetically sealed box of stainless steel and vinyl. As the heavy door clicked shut behind us, the humid, expansive air of the court was instantly replaced by a chill that seemed to seep right through my dry-fit gear. It smelled aggressively clean, a stinging cocktail of industrial disinfectant, menthol, and the biting sharpness of rubbing alcohol. It was the scent of injury management, of bodies being fixed rather than broken. I limped toward the treatment table in the center of the room. It stood there like an altar under the flickering fluorescent bank, covered in that crinkly white paper that always made you feel exposed, like a specimen waiting to be dissected. The only sound in the room was the low, rhythmic chugging of the ice machine in the corner, and the hum of the mini-fridge where they kept the insulin and the electrolyte packs. It was a mechanical, indifferent sound that somehow made the silence between us feel thicker, heavier. I hoisted myself onto the high table, wincing as the movement pulled tight against the knot in my hamstring. Sitting there, legs dangling, I felt a sudden, sharp spike of vulnerability. On the court, I was a forward, a physical force, protected by the rules of the game and the armor of my uniform. Here, elevated on the vinyl, I was just a body in pain, waiting for him. The hierarchy was physicalized. I was the patient, he was the surgeon. I gripped the edge of the table, the vinyl cold and slick under my sweating palms, and watched him. Coach Brady didn't come to the table immediately. He walked to the stainless steel sink against the far wall. He didn't look at me. He turned on the tap, and the rush of water filled the quiet room. I watched him methodically unbutton his cuffs, rolling the sleeves of his dress shirt up past his wrists, then past the thick cords of his forearms, stopping just below the elbow. It was a mundane action, something I had seen him do 100 times before practice, but in this room, at this hour, it felt like a ritual. It felt like he was preparing for something that required his hands to be bare. He pumped the soap dispenser twice. I listened to the wet, slick sound of him scrubbing his hands, the friction of skin on skin. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a erratic, thumping rhythm that had nothing to do with the sprint I had just run. I was terrified. Not of the injury. I knew pulled muscles. I knew recovery times. But of the proximity. I was terrified because the buffer of the team was gone. The buffer of the noise was gone. It was just me, the throbbing heat in my leg, and the man I had spent 2 years trying not to stare at. I was afraid that when he touched me, my body would betray something more than just a torn fiber. I was afraid the current running under my skin would be palpable to a man who made a living analyzing physical mechanics. He shut off the tap. The sudden silence was jarring. He dried his hands with a paper towel, his movements slow, deliberate, precise. He crumpled the paper and tossed it into the bin, then turned to face me. The fluorescent light caught the hard planes of his face, casting his eyes in shadow. He looked calm, controlled, dangerous. "Lie back," he said. His voice was softer in here, stripped of the gym's echo, but it still carried that undeniable weight of command. "Let the leg hang off the edge." I obeyed. I lay back, staring up at the acoustic tiles of the ceiling, counting the little black dots to keep my breathing even. In for 4, out for 4. I felt him approach the table. I felt the displacement of air as he moved into my personal space. The heat of his body registered before he even touched me, a wall of warmth standing right between my spread legs. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands gripping the sides of the table so hard my knuckles must have been white. "Relax the quad," he ordered. "You're guarding." "I'm trying," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. Then he touched me. His hands were cool from the water, a shocking contrast to the feverish heat of my skin. He placed one hand on my knee and the other just below the glute, bracketing the injury. The contact was firm, clinical, absolute. But as his fingers pressed into the flesh, testing the tension, a jolt of electricity arced through me that nearly made me buck off the table. It wasn't pain. It was a sensory overload, a collision of temperature and pressure that short-circuited my brain. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The hum of the ice machine faded into the background, drowned out by the rushing of blood in my ears. He was touching me. The barrier was gone. And God help me, I didn't want him to stop. He didn't just hold the leg, he claimed it. Brady shifted his stance, widening his base on the linoleum floor, and lifted my heel into the crook of his shoulder. It was a standard position for a hamstring stretch. I'd had it done 100 times by student trainers who chatted about their weekends while they worked. But with Brady, the mechanics were different. There was no casual chatter, no distraction. There was only the terrifying competence of his hands and the sudden, overwhelming reality of his body becoming a structural part of mine. He leaned in, using his own weight to apply the pressure. The movement was slow, a hydraulic kind of force that brooked no argument from my seizing muscle. The pain flared instantly, a bright, hot line drawn down the back of my thigh. But his hands were there to anchor it. One palm flattened against my shin to keep the leg straight. The other rested heavily on my thigh, his thumb finding the exact center of the tension. "Tell me when," he said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the contact points, traveling up my leg and settling deep in my stomach. I gritted my teeth, staring determinedly at the collar of his shirt, terrified that if I spoke, my voice would crack. I didn't want to tell him to stop. There was a masochistic relief in the pain, a sharpness that cut through the fog of my exhaustion. But more than that, I knew that as soon as I said when, he would back off. And God help me, I didn't want him to back off. I wanted to see how far he would push it. I wanted to see if he would break me. "I'm good," I managed to choke out, the lie tasting like copper. He pushed further. The stretch went deep, bypassing the muscle belly and pulling at the insertion points near the hip. My breath hitched, a sharp intake of air that was too loud in the quiet room. Brady didn't stop, but he paused, holding the tension at the absolute limit of what I could tolerate. "Breathe," he commanded. It wasn't advice. It was an instruction on how to survive him. "Don't fight it. Exhale." I let the air out in a shuddering rush. As I did, he leaned in closer. The proximity was becoming a problem. To get the leverage he needed, he had stepped completely between my spread legs. He was standing in the V of my body, his chest inches from my elevated foot. I could feel the heat radiating from his torso, a solid wall of warmth against the sole of my sneaker. If I flexed my toes, I would brush against the fabric of his dress shirt. The realization sent a spike of adrenaline through me that had nothing to do with the injury. My eyes, betraying my brain's desperate attempt at control, drifted. They moved from the safe neutrality of the ceiling tiles down to him. I watched the way his jaw set as he applied pressure. I watched a bead of sweat trace a path down his temple, disappearing into the dark hairline. I watched the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheekbones. I was drinking him in, starving for the details I was usually too afraid to look for. Suddenly, his head snapped up. He caught me. There was no time to look away, no time to feign innocence. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and arresting, pinning me to the vinyl table more effectively than his hands ever could. He didn't look away. He didn't blink. The silence that slammed into the room was deafening. He knew. In that split second, with my leg on his shoulder and my defenses completely stripped away, he saw everything I had been trying to hide for 2 seasons. He didn't step back. Instead, he pressed his thumb harder into the meat of my thigh, a sharp, grounding pressure that forced a gasp out of me. "Focus here," he said. His voice was rougher now, stripped of its clinical veneer. He wasn't pointing at the leg. He was looking straight into my eyes. The command was ambiguous, dangerous. Was he telling me to focus on the muscle? On the stretch? Or was he telling me to stay in this moment, with him, and acknowledge what was happening between us? "I'm focused," I whispered. It was a confession. Good. The word was final. He held the stretch for 10 seconds longer. An eternity. The line between therapy and intimacy began to blur until it vanished completely. This wasn't just about a tight hamstring anymore. It was about the weight of his hands on my skin. It was about the way his thumb was moving now, not just pressing, but kneading, working the knot with a slow, deliberate rhythm that felt possessive. The pain had receded into a dull thrum, replaced by a raw, hypersensitive awareness of every square inch of contact. The silence in the room became a third participant, thick and heavy, charged with things unsaid. It wasn't the empty silence of the gym. It was the pressurized silence of a dam about to break. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the wall, and the ragged cadence of my own breathing. I wondered if he could hear my heart. It was hammering against my ribs so hard I felt like it was shaking my entire body. He slowly eased the pressure, lowering my leg back down to the table. But he didn't step away. He didn't wash his hands. He stayed there, standing between my knees, his hands lingering on my skin long after the medical necessity had passed. The air around us felt thin, insufficient. I lay there, exposed and unraveled, waiting for him to sever the connection, terrified that he would, and even more terrified that he wouldn't. The medical necessity of the moment had evaporated. The cramp was gone. The muscle fibers had released their death grip on the bone, and the therapy was, by all technical definitions, complete. In any other timeline, in any other universe where the laws of professionalism still held sway, this was the part where he would step back. This was the part where he would wipe his hands, tell me to hydrate, and walk out the door, leaving me to scramble off the table and limp back to the safety of my dorm room. The clock on the wall would tick forward, the scene would end, and we would return to the safe, sterile distance of player and coach. But he didn't move. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with a sudden, suffocating density that made the air feel like water. Brady remained standing between my spread legs, his posture unyielding, a monolith in the quiet room. His hands were still on me. That was the detail that made the world stop turning. They hadn't lifted. They hadn't retreated to the safety of his pockets or the sink. They were still resting on my skin, heavy and warm, grounding me to the vinyl table. The contact was no longer clinical. Without the justification of the stretch, the touch became something else entirely. It became a choice. I lay there, paralyzed by a cocktail of exhaustion and a terrifying, blooming hope. My chest was rising and falling in a shallow, rapid rhythm that I couldn't control. I was exposed, utterly and completely. The position was vulnerable, supine, legs open, looking up at him. But the emotional exposure was worse. I felt like he had peeled back the skin of my thigh and was looking directly at the nerves firing beneath it. I wanted to close my legs. I wanted to sit up and crack a joke, to reassemble the armor I wore on the court. But I couldn't. My body had surrendered to his authority long before my mind had caught up. Then, his thumb moved. It wasn't a squeeze. It wasn't the digging pressure of a deep tissue release. It was a slow, deliberate drag of his thumb against the sensitive skin of my inner thigh. He was tracing the line of the adductor, following the path of the muscle up toward the hip. It was a ghost of a touch, barely there, but it sent a shockwave through me that rattled my teeth. The sensation was maddening. It was the feeling of a boundary being erased, inch by slow, agonizing inch. He wasn't fixing an injury anymore. He was exploring the landscape. I stared at the ceiling tiles, my vision blurring, trying to process the shift in reality. The word coach began to dissolve in my mind. For 2 years, that title had been a fortress. It was a wall that separated us, a clear delineation of power and protocol. He was the authority, I was the instrument. He was the strategy, I was the execution. But that title couldn't survive the heat of his hand on my inner thigh. It was melting, dripping away like wax, leaving behind just the man, just Brady, just the dark, intense gravity of him that I had been orbiting helplessly since the first day of tryouts. I realized, with a jolt of pure panic, that I didn't want him to stop. The fear was there, the fear of the rules, the fear of the scandal, the fear of losing the only thing in my life that made sense. But it was being swallowed whole by a hunger I had never dared to name. I wanted his hands to go higher. I wanted the pressure to increase. I wanted him to shatter the rest of the professional distance and claim the wreckage. His hand drifted higher, just a fraction of an inch, pressing into the soft, unprotected skin near the groin. It was a pressure point, a cluster of nerves that had no business being touched in a training room. The reaction was involuntary. A sound escaped my throat, a ragged, wet gasp that tore through the silence like a fabric ripping. My hips bucked slightly, a reflex, a body trying to move closer to the source of the heat. I froze. The sound hung in the air, an undeniable admission of what this was doing to me. Shame flushed hot up my neck, burning my ears. I had broken the code. I had reacted. I waited for the reprimand. I waited for him to pull away in disgust, to lecture me on boundaries, to tell me to get out. But the hand didn't leave. Brady paused. His thumb rested heavily on the pulse point of my inner thigh, feeling the erratic, rabbit-fast hammer of my heart beating through the artery. He didn't retreat. He didn't apologize. Instead, he slowly lowered his gaze from the wall behind me to my face. The look he gave me stripped me bare. It wasn't the look of a coach checking on an athlete. It was dark, heavy, and knowing. He saw the flush on my chest. He saw the way my hands were gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. He heard the gasp. And he didn't look away. In that moment, the terrifying truth settled over me. He wasn't doing this by accident. He knew exactly where his hand was. He knew exactly what it was doing to me. And he had no intention of moving it. The precipice was gone. We were already falling. The silence following that look was a physical weight. My survival instinct finally screamed awake. It was a frantic panic that had nothing to do with the injury and everything to do with the man standing between my legs. I had shown him too much. I had let the mask slip, and underneath was just a desperate kid who wanted to be touched. I had to fix it. I had to rewind the tape. I jerked upward, my elbows digging into the vinyl as I tried to scramble into a sitting position. I needed to get vertical. I needed to put at least 3 feet of sterile air between us. "I'm fine," I blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. "It feels better. Loose. I can walk on it now. Thanks, coach. Seriously." I made to swing my legs off the side of the table, a clumsy maneuver to escape before I did something unforgivable, like reach for him. "Stay." The word was a wall. He didn't shout it. He didn't even raise his voice. He just dropped the syllable into the air, and it stopped me cold. His hand, which had been resting on my thigh, didn't grab me. That would have been too aggressive. Instead, it just became heavy. He leaned his weight into his palm, grounding me to the table, pinning the leg I was trying to move. It wasn't a restraint. It was an anchor. I froze, half sitting, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked up at him, breathless, waiting for the lecture. Waiting for him to tell me to stop acting like a child. "You're running," he observed quietly. His eyes were dark, searching mine with a terrifying intensity. "Why?" I'm not, I lied, my voice thin. I need to ice it. I need to go. You're lying. He stepped closer. The space between us, already non-existent, seemed to contract even further. The air conditioning vent above us kicked on with a low hum, blowing freezing air down onto my sweat-damp skin. But I was burning up. The heat radiating from him was a physical force. Tell me, he said, his voice dropping an octave. What are you afraid of? The question hung there. What was I afraid of? I was afraid of everything. I was afraid of the way his name sounded in my head when I was trying to sleep. I was afraid of the fact that I played harder when he was watching, not for the team, but for the crumb of validation he might drop. I was afraid that if he kept looking at me like that, I would forget that he was my coach and I was his player, and I would do something that would burn my entire scholarship to the ground. It wasn't fear of him. I wasn't afraid he would hurt me. I was afraid of the sheer, terrifying magnitude of how much I wanted him to. I was afraid that the line I had drawn in the sand, the line of professionalism, had been washed away months ago, and I was just now admitting that I was drowning. I can't, I whispered. I looked down at his hand, still resting on my leg. The contrast of his tanned skin against my pale thigh was stark. Coach, I can't do this. Do what? He challenged. Be honest? Be here, I corrected, looking back up. Like this. With you. We're just checking an injury, he said. But the words were hollow. We both knew it was a lie. We were miles past injury management. We were in the deep water now. Is that what this is? I asked, my voice trembling. I was pushing back, testing the reality. Just checking an injury? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at me, really looked at me, dissecting the fear and the desire warring behind my eyes. The room felt impossibly small, a hermetically sealed box containing just the two of us and this volatile, unspoken thing. You tell me, he murmured. You're the one shaking. He was right. A fine tremor was running through my hands, up my arms. I was vibrating with the effort of holding still, of not leaning into his touch. The fear was morphing into something else. Anticipation. The terrifying realization that I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to leave. I was going to stay right here and let the fall happen. Because the alternative, walking out that door and never knowing, was worse. I'm afraid, I admitted, the truth tearing its way out of my throat, that if I stay, I won't be able to stop. Good, he said softly. Then don't. The admission shattered the last structural support of my resistance. I wasn't a victim of circumstance here. I was a willing participant in my own unraveling. The professional boundary wasn't something he was taking from me. It was something I was handing him, piece by jagged piece, begging him to destroy it. He moved then. It wasn't a sudden lunge, but a slow, calculated invasion that dismantled the last remaining fortifications of my personal space. He took his hand off my leg. The loss of contact was a sudden, cold shock, only to place it on the vinyl table right beside my hip. The vinyl creaked under the shifting weight, a sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. He leaned over me, his other hand bracing against the wall behind my head, effectively caging me in. I was boxed in by the breadth of his shoulders and the undeniable reality of his desire. The harsh fluorescent light above was blocked out by his silhouette, casting me into a shadow that felt safer, more intimate, and infinitely more dangerous than the exposure of the room. You think I haven't seen you? He asked, his voice a low grit against the silence, vibrating with a frustration I had never heard him vocalize. You think I haven't felt you tracking me across the gym floor for the last 6 months? I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, constricted by a mix of terror and elation. I shook my head, a microscopic movement against the crinkling paper of the table. I have, he continued, the confession tumbling out with the force of a landslide, burying the professional distance we had maintained for seasons. Every drill, every free throw, I felt your eyes on me like a physical weight. You think you're the only one fighting this? You think you're the only one who stays late just to be in the same room, pretending it's about the work? The validation hit me harder than the injury had. It wasn't just me. I wasn't some delusional kid projecting a fantasy onto his mentor. The tension, the electricity, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of our practices. It was real. It was mutual. The discipline he was so famous for, the rigid control he exerted over the team, over the game, over me. It hadn't been indifference. It had been a leash. A restraint he had been pulling against just as hard as I had, his knuckles white with the effort of holding back. I started, my voice cracking, barely audible over the hum of the ice machine. I thought I was crazy. I thought you hated how much I needed this. I don't hate it, he murmured, the admission dark and heavy. He shifted closer, his chest inches from mine, the heat of him soaking through my shirt. I'm terrified of what happens if I let go. I'm terrified of what I'll take. Don't stop, I pleaded. The words left my mouth before I could vet them, bypassing the filter of self-preservation. It was the command I had been screaming in my head all season, the only truth that mattered. Please, Coach, don't stop. He froze at the title. Coach. It was a reminder of the cliff we were standing on, the career-ending drop that awaited us. But instead of backing away, he destroyed the title completely. He reached out. This time, he didn't touch a muscle group. He didn't check a tendon or correct a stance. He brought his hand up and cupped my jaw. The contact was electric. His palm was rough, calloused from years of handling basketballs and clipboards, but his touch was agonizingly gentle. His thumb brushed over my cheekbone, tracing the line of my face with a reverence that made my breath hitch in a sob. The touch changed everything. It wasn't therapeutic. It was possessive. It was an acknowledgement that I wasn't just a player to be fixed. I was something he wanted to keep. The dam broke. The months of stoicism, of yes sir and no sir, of hiding in the locker room and staring at the floor, it all washed away in the flood of his proximity. I leaned into his hand, closing my eyes, surrendering the last of my control to the friction of his skin against mine. I can't be your coach right now, he whispered, his thumb dragging across my lower lip, pulling it down slightly, exposing the shallow, desperate breaths I was taking. I don't want to coach, I breathed, the air between us superheated, volatile. I just want you. He made a sound, a low groan of defeat that vibrated in his chest. The restraint was gone. The leash had snapped. He looked at me, his eyes dark with a hunger that mirrored my own, a hunger that had been starved for too long in the sterile air of the gym. He lowered his head, blocking out the rest of the world, narrowing the universe down to the space between our mouths. There was no more strategy. There was no more game plan. There was only the inevitable, terrifying collision waiting to happen. The collision, when it finally came, wasn't the crash of two things breaking. It was the heavy, thudding lock of two things finally fitting together. When his mouth met mine, the sensation was absolute, a sudden, overwhelming gravity that pulled the floor out from under the room. It wasn't the frantic, stolen fumble of two people afraid of getting caught. It was a reclaiming. It was the release of a pressure valve that had been screaming in the red for 2 solid years. A soundless explosion that erased the gym, the injury, and the rules in a single heartbeat. He didn't kiss like a man asking a question. He kissed like a man stating a fact. The pressure was heavy, desperate, and inevitable. I felt the rough scrape of his stubble against my chin, a tactile friction that felt jarringly real against the smooth, sterile world we usually inhabited. He tasted of that bitter black coffee he drank by the gallon, and the mint from the gum he chewed during games to hide his stress. But underneath that, he tasted like him, like the dark, intense focus that I had spent every practice trying to earn. My hands, usually so disciplined, usually so careful to keep their distance, found their way into the fabric of his dress shirt. I bunched the material in my fists, pulling him closer, anchoring him to me, as if I could drag him inside my own ribcage. I needed him to be closer than physics allowed. I felt him shift, his weight pressing me down into the vinyl table, pinning me there. It wasn't trapping me, it was holding me together. The pain in my leg was gone, eclipsed entirely by the searing heat of his body against mine. The fear I had been carrying, the fear of the rules, the fear of the scholarship, the fear of the fall, didn't explode. It just evaporated. In the heat of that contact, the terror burned off, leaving behind a strange, crystalline clarity. This wasn't a mistake. I knew that with a certainty that rattled my bones. A mistake feels like a stumble, a loss of footing. This felt like finding the ground for the first time. The silence that had always stretched between us, the silence I had interpreted as judgment, I now understood was just waiting. It was a space we had both been carving out, terrified to fill, until this exact moment. He broke the kiss, but didn't pull away. He rested his forehead against mine, our breathing ragged and synchronized, filling the quiet space between us. His hands moved from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, gripping tight. It was a grounding technique. He was physically keeping me present, refusing to let me drift into panic or regret. "I've got you," he whispered. The voice was wrecked, rough, stripped of all its command, and left with only raw honesty. "I've got you. You're okay." It wasn't just reassurance. It was a promise. In a building designed for stoicism, where weakness was a liability and pain was something to be ignored, we had found a pocket of absolute vulnerability. He wasn't fixing me. He wasn't coaching me. He was just holding me. The intimacy of it was staggering. It wasn't just about the physical act. It was about the shared collapse of the walls we had built. We were two people who lived by strict codes of conduct, finally admitting that the only law that mattered was this pull, this undeniable current that ran between us. We stayed like that for a long time, foreheads touching, eyes closed, existing in the eye of the storm. The realization settled over me, heavy and warm. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a recalibration of our reality. The world outside the training room, the team, the season, the expectations, still existed, but it felt distant, less substantial than the weight of his hand on my neck. Slowly, reluctantly, the physical world began to bleed back in. The hum of the ice machine returned to the foreground. The chill of the air conditioning brushed against my overheated skin. Brady pulled back, just an inch, just enough to look me in the eyes. The distance was small, but it felt like a canyon after the closeness of the last minute. He didn't look regretful. He looked awake. He looked like a man who had finally stopped holding his breath. "You okay?" Brady asked. His voice was low, rougher than usual, a gravelly sound that scraped against the quiet of the room. He didn't move far, just enough to let the air circulate between us again, breaking the seal of our proximity without severing the connection. I nodded, though my pulse was still thudding a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. "Yeah," I breathed, the word feeling inadequate. "I think so." The world didn't snap back into place immediately. The fluorescent lights were still humming their indifferent mechanical tune overhead. The cold air of the training room still smelled aggressively of menthol and sharp antiseptic. My leg was still throbbing with a dull, distant ache, a reminder of the physical failure that had started this. But the texture of reality had fundamentally shifted. The sterile white walls didn't feel like a cage anymore. They felt like witnesses. The silence wasn't a vacuum waiting to be filled with anxiety. It was a container for the heat that was still radiating between us. Brady stepped back fully then, his hands leaving my skin with a reluctance that was palpable. He didn't immediately button his collar or smooth his shirt. He let the disarray stand for a moment, a visual acknowledgement of the crash. He looked at me, his gaze steady and grounding, stripping away the panic before it could take root in the sudden space between us. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely to the charged air between us. "We figure this out. You hear me?" It was the coach voice, but repurposed. It wasn't a command to run a play or fix a defensive rotation. It was a command to trust the process. He was ensuring the ground was solid before we tried to walk on it. He was validating the consent, making sure I knew this wasn't an accident, or a mistake, or a misuse of the authority he held. It was a mutual collapse. "We figure it out," I repeated, the words feeling heavy and permanent on my tongue. He nodded, satisfied. The shift to domesticity was jarring in its gentleness. He reached out, not to touch my face this time, but to offer a hand. I took it. He braced me as I slid off the high table, his grip firm on my forearm, taking my weight until my good leg found the floor. He didn't let go until I was steady, testing my balance. He bent down, grabbed my gym bag from where I dropped it near the door hours ago, and handed it to me. His fingers brushed mine in the transfer, a small, deliberate friction that sent a fresh spark through the lingering exhaustion. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, shouldering the bag. "I can walk." We left the training room, the heavy door clicking shut on the sanctuary of chrome and tile we had created. The walk down the long, echoing hallway was different now. The echoes of our footsteps didn't sound lonely. We walked side by side, not touching, but the magnetic field between us was alive. We pushed through the glass double doors and out into the night. The air hit us, cool, damp, smelling of rain on asphalt. It felt cleaner than the recycled air inside. It felt like a new season. Standing in the parking lot, under the amber glow of the street lamps, the fear that had defined my life for 2 years finally dissolved. I realized that the secret of how I felt, the secret of what we were, wasn't a prison anymore. It wasn't a burden I had to carry alone across the court. It was a fortress. It was something we built, something we shared, something that kept the rest of the world out, while we figured out how to exist within it. He waited until I reached my car, watching to make sure I was safe. He didn't say goodbye. He just nodded, a silent, weighted confirmation that the conversation wasn't over, just paused. I got in, the heavy thud of the door sealing me inside, but the warmth of his hands was still printed on my skin. The coach was still the coach, but the silence between us would never be empty again. If you know what it's like to finally let the walls down, subscribe and share this story.